Thank you so much for coming to this great event. I'm really happy to be here actually. It's my first time presenting, so bear with me. So before we start, I will just give one quick intro about myself. My name is Lokmane Krizou, and I'm a software engineer here at Skyscanner. And I'm originally from Algeria, and I started my career almost like 6 or 5 years ago. I began actually as a VR developer and then switched gears and to become an Android developer. And it's been an amazing journey so far. So enough talking about me actually, and let's start talking about the app global components and how we can expand the reusability across beyond the UI layer. So without further ado, let's jump to our agenda. So we will begin with discussing the challenges about the UI duplication and how we can prevent that. And then we will see why design systems are not enough for some cases. And then after that, we will discuss about the global component theory and then see some case studies that we had at Skyscanner. And after that, we will set up some guidelines and rules to make sure that you can use your components across all the screens and across all the app. And then last but not least, we will discuss what can be done next. And basically this section will be open floor for you if you want to have like any other ideas or any suggestions for future that we can do. All right, so imagine that you are basically working on your day-to-day job and fixing bugs and everything, and then your manager comes in and say, hey, I need you to create this screen. And you get excited probably, and you start working on it, and probably you finish it quite fast and you ship it. Then later on, your manager will come back and say, I need you to create more screens. And as soon as you start working on these screens, you start to notice that some UI components are actually already existing in the first page, and you start to wonder, do you need actually to create this UI component from scratch? Or for example, if you have same UI components but different styles, do you need also to create each UI component for each style? And last but not least, if you are actually working on a multi-module project, since you have a lot of features over there and you want to expand your modules to make sure that every single one in the team that can work actually and contribute and take ownership, of course, then you would discuss about how you can actually share this UI component across all different modules. If you already asked these questions, then probably you already know about some this concept about design systems. If not, then design systems are actually just a collection of reused design resources and also some UI components and the guidelines that actually can help you to expand your sorry, not expand, but it will actually help you to create product and features at a scale, and also make sure that you can maintain the consistency across all the app. And as you can see here, we have at Skyscanner this backpack design system library, which is actually an open source library that you can use to create your Skyscanner app or Skyscanner clone app if you want. And we can leave a link to it later on if you want to try it out. But let's actually see why sometimes design systems are not enough for you to reuse your UI components or your features in general. So back again to the imagination, we have this time the project manager will come back and say, I need to create this place selector component. And as you can see, it's just basically just adding the name or typing the name, and then it will give you some results, and then you can select one of them. And from that, you also need to not just create it once, but you need to also reuse it across all the screens by just tapping on the navbar, and it will show. At this stage, you might think, okay, this is actually a simple one. You just create the UI component once using the design systems, and then you maintain the consistency across all the screens. But it's actually not that easy, because you have to think about different layers and different perspective. Like every single screen, you need to actually use a different endpoint to show the results, and also you need to make sure that every single screen has its certain configurations that you need to take care about, and it should actually make sure that every single screen should show the right results. And at this stage, if you are using just the design systems to create the UI and then duplicate the other layers across the other screens or the other features, then you might end up in a situation where sometimes probably like the product manager will come back and say, we need actually to make some changes, and then you end up actually doing the changes across all the screens. And this is really not good, because we tend to actually make sure that we don't duplicate code while we are creating features. And this is why actually, if you are only relying on design systems to create UI components and features in general, then it's actually not enough. And this is when the global component theory comes into place, and it's basically just a simple one. It's a piece of UI that holds the business logic, and it can actually be reused across all the screens and across all the features by a defined API already. And for our theory, we have actually two types of global components. We have the first one, which is the closed global component, and it comes with already predefined data source, and you already have some configuration that is already in place that you don't need to touch, and the consumer only needs to call the component and it should show on the screen, and that's it. A good example for that we have at Skyscanner is this favorite button feature that when you click on it, it will actually launch and check if actually you're already logged in. If yes, then it will just show you a list that you can add the favorite itinerary to. Otherwise, it will ask you to log in. And as you can see, this is actually in our flight screen. And all we need to do here is just call this feature, and it will actually allow the user to interact with it and do all the things internally. No need for the consumer to know about anything. And a good showcase for that is if you go to the hotel screen, which is a completely different screen, it has also this same favorite button feature, which does the same thing, but it's actually completely isolated from the consumer, which is actually great. You don't need to recreate the logic and the feature over and over. You can just go there and make the changes, and you can see it on all the screens. The other type of the global components is actually called open global component, which is a funny name because it doesn't have any creativity actually. And if you want to have like a better name, please give us some ideas. But for this in general, it's actually just the opposite of the closed global component. It has actually already for the consumer, it should actually have the implementation of the data source rather than us inside the global component who should actually create it. And another thing is actually this component is actually configurable, so every single consumer can go to this component, make the changes via the configuration, and then it should actually do the job. A good example for this is actually this place selector component, and as you can see in flights and car hire, they are pretty the same. It's actually the same feature almost, but the only thing is you can see the difference in the content or the results, and also some sections that are actually not the same because each screen actually has its own configuration. And this is like a brief introduction about what is this global component. And to put this in practice, we actually had some case studies at Skyscanner. The first one is basically the place selector again. And this time, if you can see it clearly, it's actually completely different from one screen to another, because even though the, the functionality is the same, but you can see that every single screen shows different results, and also some sections are a bit different from one feature, one screen to another, and the hotels one is actually completely different. And the reason is every single screen had to implement its own place selector component, and meaning we had a lot of duplication of code. Another example is actually this traveler selector. It's basically the same case that we had for place selector. It's the same functionality, but every single consumer actually created its own component, and we had a lot of issues over there, because every time if the design or product wants to make any change, they might do it in one screen but not for the rest, and then you end up with inconsistency over here. And at this time, if your product manager asks you to make any change, you basically will just throw your laptop. And otherwise, you could actually follow what we tried to do here to make it configurable and reusable across all the screens. So we started actually from this stage, and we end up in this one configurable place selector that can be actually reused across all the screens by just defining some sets of configurations and some implementing of data sources. And before, like what we started to do here is actually, first of all, we checked whether it's a closed global component or an open global component. And the simple answer for this is actually it's an open global component, because I was already saying that almost like since I started. This is actually a configurable feature. So a closed global component is actually handles everything internally. There is no need for configuration. Meanwhile, for the open global component, it requires some configuration from the consumer. And what we did next is we tried to define this required sections, and also these optional sections, and last but not least the configurable sections. And you might ask, what's the difference actually between the configurable sections and optional sections? Like, it's almost the same thing. The only difference is actually the optional sections, and actually both optional sections and the required sections comes from the data source. So the data source decides whether we should show this section or not. Meanwhile, for the configurable section, it can be always there, but if the consumer wants to hide it, you can just go to the configuration and then set a feature flag over there to turn it off. And one thing to note here is actually this current location section. If you go to the app, you can see it on every single selector, but what we decided here, because it was actually created multiple times, and we don't think there is like any need for like exposing data source for this current location section, we just took this section and put all the logic internally, and then we just exposed the configuration to the consumer. So for some screens or some verticals, as we call them, some of them actually requires current location section, and some of them are basically don't need it. So after when we defined the sections, we went through the best part, which is the design system. And once we had the sections, we actually need to define the global component API. And it's actually just a simple interface, as you can see down below. And it's actually just a dummy example. It's not like the actual implementation. So there are two functions over there. One of them to get the required sections, and the other one to get the you get the optional sections. And that's basically what the API looks like. You add it to this contract module that we have as a structure of our project. We put every interface or every API in this contract module, and the actual implementation should set inside the the implementation module. And the reason of that, it's actually to make sure that whenever we like if you have like a lot of contributors and you have like a lot of features, if someone wants to make a change to feature A, and this feature actually depends on feature B, but you can just use the contractor module, then you don't need to actually change anything on feature B, because you just need to make a change on the interface or the API. And the other thing which is good is if you have this structure, you would actually save a lot of time, save a lot of compiler time instead. And if you want to know more about this kind of structure, there is actually another DroidCon talk that has been probably like in the last 2 years, like 2021, and it's been done by another colleague of mine. His name is Haroldo, and I will leave the link to the section or the talk at the end of this presentation. So after when you have the API defined, you would actually also define this provider, which actually just returns the UI and also passes the configuration to our implementation or to our place selector global component module. And the configuration is actually just a simple data model that contains all the things that you need to configure. One of them is the source, and the source is actually just an indicator or an enum class that indicates which screen that we are actually running on. And you can use that later on for other needs if you want. Once you have that, both the place selector repository or the API as we call it, and then you have also the provider, then your next thing to do is actually make sure that you manage the unsuccessful state. To manage the unsuccessful state, you need actually to involve the product and design to make sure that you don't make decisions that are going to affect you later on, and you want to show the exact state that you need for the users to see. And last but not least, if you have everything in place, then your consumer now is actually just going to take the API and implement the data sources to provide the results and use the provider to show the UI. And this is what it's going to be, because you already had a lot of work with design and product. Make sure that you always involve them to get all the requirements needed, and to make sure that if there is any alignment, then it should be tackled before actually starting the implementation. Because once you start the implementation, you don't want to get interrupted with the requirement changes and everything. And one of the benefits that actually we had is, once we had this feature in one module, now we can actually easily track it and make sure that if anything goes down, then we already have one source of truth, and it's basically the place selector module, rather than going through every single feature module or every single screen that has this feature and check if the code is going wrong over there. I will basically just show all the benefits that we had. So the second one was actually easy to scale. So once we had this module in one place, we actually now actually can be easily to add more features or add more enhancements to this feature. And the last one was actually not the last one, but actually we have more. But the last one in the list over there was the insurance accessibility, because using this new module and also by using the backpack design library, it actually ensures the accessibility and make sure that the users had a good experience. And we make sure that every single user, whether with accessibility needs or he can actually use the app, then he will always have this good experience. And once we set up everything, we actually went and write some guidelines to make sure that if we have any future components that we need to write, we need to actually determine some guidelines for that, So the first one was actually, before you start, you need to make sure that whether you are creating an open global component or a closed global component. And as we mentioned before, the closed one is actually just an isolated feature that just exposes the API. So if you are going to create one of those, then it's actually simple as that. You just put them in one module and expose your API. Meanwhile, if it's an open global component, then you have to define more rules. And the second one, this is actually more now for just the open global component. If you are going to create one place selector, not place selector. If you are going to create one open global component, then you need to define the required and optional common functionalities. And by doing that, you need to make sure that if one screen or one feature already, like you have, requires one feature but the other screens doesn't need that feature or that functionality, then you make sure that you speak with the product and design and see if you can align with them and see if we can actually expand the use of this functionality to the other screens. If not, then we can always leave it as an optional and make sure again to involve product and design. I'm stressing about that because it's really important, and we had a lot of benefits from that when we actually started to implement this feature, because it was really a mess at the beginning. I wouldn't say like a mess, but it's just like completely different from one screen to another. But the way we actually ended up with one feature that aligns with every single screen, it was really incredible. One thing to make sure is once you have this required and optional functionalities defined, you need also to define which functionalities that can be actually handled internally inside your component, and the rest that can be actually configured by the consumer. So for instance, if you remember from the previous example, the one that we talked about, it was the current location. It was actually already implemented on all the screens, but it was actually the same, so there is no need to push the responsibility to consumer. We can just implement it internally and then expose a configuration for that to either enable it or disable it. And for like data, the data sources, like the results, we actually need to get them from every single consumer, so that should be handled by the consumers and it should go to their responsibilities. Once you have that, you need to make sure that you define your component configurations, and that's actually like the simplest part, I would say, because if you already have all the sections, you just need to make sure that which one can be configured and which one can be always required. And of course, while you are doing everything, you need to make sure that you are not going to be like too much flexible. You need actually to always think about how you can remain consistent, because if you are going to be flexible, then you might end up to create or add a lot of functionalities that doesn't add up. Like for instance, if your place selector component actually also requires to select a date, then that doesn't make sense, because this is a completely new feature and can be actually created in its own component instead of merging it to this place selector component. And of course, if you are creating some new functionalities, you need to make sure, and it's actually reused by all the screens, then you need to make sure that you speak with product and design and see if you can add this functionality while remaining consistent by all the screens. And once you have everything in place, you need to also make sure that whenever you have some unexpected states or error states, you need to define the acceptance criteria for failure resilience. And by doing everything, of course, you need to involve product and design. Every single step, you need always to involve them. And I can't stress this enough. And yeah, so those are actually all the requirements and the guidelines that you need to follow. And if you want to know about what can be done next, is actually really simple, because if you have already the domain that is actually going to be reusable across all the screen, or across all the apps, sorry, what can be done is actually, why not taking this component, or at least the domain layer and data source layer of it, and expose it to another library that can be reused across platforms. And that's actually something that we really need to do, but I'm not sure if our priorities will allow that for now, but that's something we can definitely try to explore in the future and share any learners from that. But yeah, thank you so much, and